Stage Fright, as its title suggests, is a story of the theatre. The two female leads, played by Jane Wyman and Marlene Dietrich, are actresses, and there are numerous sequences set in London theatres, including the rehearsal room of RADA and the now demolished Scala Theatre in Fitzrovia. This was the first real London film that Hitchcock made since he'd relocated to America in 1939, and it was shot extensively on location in the city. He was born in London, he lived in the city for the first 40 years of his life basically, and he spent the first 20 years of his career working in its film studios. Although of course he absorbed many kind of cosmopolitan influences during this time. He trained with American filmmakers for a period, and his first films were made in Germany. But Hitch was undoubtedly inspired and enriched by London's geography, its inhabitants, its architecture, its crime, transport, food and entertainment. Into the 1940s and beyond, Britain and London in particular remained important to his films. It was a recurring setting even when it was recreated in Hollywood. He used many British actors in his films and television shows, and he and his writers frequently adapted British novels, short stories and plays. So let's start with Sabotage, a British film from 1936, based on a novel by Joseph Conrad, The Secret Agent, published in 2007. But Hitchcock and his writer Charles Bennett, as they often did, took some liberties with the source material. In Conrad's original novel, Verloc's business wasn't a cinema, it was in fact a rather sort of seedy shop. So by replacing it with a cinema, I think is quite a meaningful change. As Hitchcock scholar Charles Barr has pointed out, this creates a very nice juxtaposition between two key elements of Hitchcock's biography, cinema and the greengrocers. So Hitchcock was born in Leytonstone, East London in August 1899. His father was a retail and wholesale grocer and later fishmonger, and the Hitchcock family lived above the shop. As we know, Hitchcock chose the cinema as his vocation rather than entering the family business, but I would say that his background did inflect aspects of his films. So fruit and vegetables, along with other foodstuffs, often take on a symbolic role in his films. While grocers' shops were not a regular staple actually in the films, it's intriguing that he returned to this sort of setting towards the very end of his career with the serial killer film Frenzy, which is set in and around Covent Garden fruit and vegetable market. It was the first film that he'd shot on location in London since portions of The Second Man Who Knew Too Much 16 years before. And it must have been quite an experience for him, I think, to have come back to London and be shooting on the streets of the city, and especially in Covent Garden, where his father had plied his trade many years before. Apparently when they were filming on location in Covent Garden, an old man from the market came up and spoke to Hitchcock and told him that he'd known his father many, many years before, and the two withdrew for a private conversation from which Hitchcock emerged visibly moved. I suspect that this blast from the past, combined with the fact that Hitchcock and his wife Alma had had some health problems around this time, combined to kind of give him a strong sense of his own mortality. All of his life, Hitchcock was fascinated with crime, detection, and the processes of justice and punishment. He frequently attributed his legendary fear of the police to being sent to the police station as a young boy by his father with a note, which he handed over to the officer in charge, and he was promptly locked in a cell. He was eventually released with the admonition, "This is what happens to naughty boys." So he may have been afraid of police, but he was still fascinated, and as a young man he visited Scotland Yard's notorious Black Museum, which was an exhibition of kind of case exhibits and other objects that were gathered during police investigations. Hitchcock was fascinated by the items that were on display, and he singled out the shoes of Victorian prostitutes. His biographer Donald Spoto records him as saying, "Did you know that the colour of every scarlet woman's shoes determined what her speciality was? If a man saw a prostitute walking along Waterloo Bridge at night, he knew she did one thing in red heels, another in blue heels." So when Hitchcock was growing up in East London, the Jack the Ripper murders were still a fairly recent memory, and he also became fascinated by later criminals like Dr. Crippen and then later on Neville Heath. The spectre of Jack the Ripper, of course, haunts Hitchcock's third feature and his first real London film, The Lodger. Based on the novel by Mary Belloc Lowndes, it tells the story of a mysterious man played by the rather dashing Ivan Novello, who turns up at a Pimlico boarding house. He begins wooing the golden-haired daughter of the house, much to the dissatisfaction of her policeman-suitor Joe, and to the increasing anxiety of her mother, her landlady Mrs. Bunting, who becomes very suspicious of her lodger's nocturnal outings, which just happen to coincide with a spate of murders of young blonde women. He says, when I was making The Lodger, the one thing I wanted above all else was to do a night scene in London, preferably on the Embankment. I wanted to silhouette the mass of Charing Cross Bridge against the sky. He wanted to show a body being pulled out of the river, and Scotland Yard said no. The filmmakers tried to pull strings, and although permission wasn't given, they were eventually told that if they wanted to go ahead and do it, they wouldn't be stopped. But they went down there one night and set up masses of lights and all of their equipment. Hitchcock did get the shot that he wanted, but he later reported that he was dismayed when he got to see the rushes and that shot was not there. And he said that apparently the cameraman had forgotten to put the lens into the camera for that particular scene. After this, Scotland Yard becomes a frequently recurring setting in Hitchcock's films. In Blackmail, it's a key location. So the heroine's boyfriend, Frank, is a flying squad detective, and we first see him at the beginning of the film apprehending a suspect and taking him back to the yard for interrogation and eventually incarceration. Places of justice are also important. It did criminal trials at the Old Bailey, and it was a major setting in the Paradigm case, a London set Hollywood film. The Central Criminal Court No. 1 was painstakingly and expensively recreated in the studio. Another one of Hitchcock's early obsessions was transport. His biographer writes that by the time he was 8, he had ridden every tram line in London and had taken river steamers to the mouth of the Thames at Gravesend. And he developed an encyclopedic knowledge of the London transport network. So I think it's therefore quite a nice touch that Hitchcock's first extended cameo is as an underground passenger in Blackmail. Hitchcock met his wife Alma in the early 1920s when they both worked at famous Players Lasky's Islington studio. It's worth very briefly noting that she was more important and experienced than he was when they first met, and that Hitchcock waited until he had sort of risen up through the ranks before speaking to her. Alma worked as assistant director on his first films, and it was after the third of these, The Lodger, that they got married in December 1926. They moved to Cromwell Road immediately after their marriage, and as well as a place to live, it very much served as a place to work. They had story conferences and script writing sessions there throughout the late 1920s and through the 1930s, and these were often quite sort of fun, raucous, alcohol-fueled events, but also very serious in their purpose. In a very fun magazine article from 1930 talking about the making of Murder, Hitchcock writes about his and Alma's flight back into the city, leaving the bucolic distractions of their country home near Guildford, and returning to the sort of noise and the stimulation of the city. And this is what Hitchcock writes in the article. Here I was, perched on the roof of London in my fourth floor flat, a helpful gramophone waiting to subdue the noisy war of hooters versus klaxons, waging battle in the outside regions. District Underground trains went clattering by 100 feet below, but in full view at the back. Coming from the far distance was that conglomeration of indistinguishable sounds which go to make up town life. I mentioned earlier that the director Michael Powell, best known for films such as A Matter of Life and Death, 1946, and The Red Shoes, 1948, worked with Hitchcock as a young man. He took on set stills for a number of Hitchcock's late silents, and he was one of the collaborators on the script for Blackmail, although he doesn't get a credit for that. In his autobiography, Powell wrote of Hitchcock and London, sorry, this is quite a long quote, "Quite apart from being a Cockney from the East End of London, Hitch's knowledge of London was peculiar and delightful east of Temple Bar. Towards the West End, he had in his films a more conventional approach because to him, it only meant eating well in expensive restaurants or going to the theatre to see some actor or actress who'd made a hit. But the lower middle class Londoners of our film, shopkeepers, barrow boys, hawkers, match girls, hangers-on at the tails of the garment business, policemen, detective, reporters, coppers, narcs, thieves and pickpockets, he continually delighted me with the extent of his knowledge and the sharpness of his observation." So the use of the Albert Hall in the remake of The Man Who Knew Too Much is just one of the many examples of how Hitchcock continued to feature London in his films long after his move to Hollywood. Of course, he made many iconic American set films too, and the sense of place is very important in films like Shadow of a Doubt, which is small-town America, and Vertigo, in which San Francisco takes on a kind of beautiful, magical kind of air. Hitchcock was famously unfaithful to his source material. He readily took the sort of basic idea or concept of a novel, a story or play, and often completely reworked them into his own sort of shape and into cinematic terms. And this is true for some London and British set originals which were transplanted to America. So Patrick Hamilton's play Rope, for instance, was moved from Mayfair to Manhattan, and I think this was a sort of transition that worked really well, actually. The Birds, just to tie in with the film that we're seeing tonight, was originally a Cornish set short story, which was transplanted to California with a blonde heroine replacing Daphne du Maurier's farmer protagonist. But for a number of films, retaining or giving them a London setting was vitally important. Hitchcock was very annoyed that he couldn't shoot Dial M for Murder in London, and he campaigned so he could at least have some second unit footage and realistic West London backdrops for the film. Hitchcock relished using the city in a number of his later films. This is borne out, I think, by the fact that he returned to the city in the last decade of his life to make Frenzy, which is an incredibly London-rich film, albeit one that preserves or presents a somewhat old-fashioned view of the city in the early 70s. But as I said at the beginning, it's very much a homecoming film, and I think it brought Hitchcock's career sort of full circle in a way by returning to a serial killer story in the mode of The Lodger, but which was made nearly half a century before. Thank you very much for listening to me this evening. I hope that this talk will inspire you to see some more of Hitchcock's films during our season, and also perhaps take a stroll around the city following in the footsteps of the director and his characters. And I hope that for those of you who are going to see The Birds tonight, that you enjoy the film in this beautiful London setting of Somerset House. Thank you.